What lessons are to be learned on the 20th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. This is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you all the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
It's good to see you and to be with our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, how are things going at the Citadel and your professorial role there and teaching students?
Doing good. In the middle of the semester, students are learning important things on the evils of overreaching government in my economics classes. So things are going well.
That's great. Well, Richard has written an article for us on a monthly basis for quite some time now. In fact, when we started FFF, he was writing for us every month till he became president of the Foundation for Economic Education. So if you want to see some of those old articles, in fact, Richard, interesting tidbit, I referenced your article talking about the monetary crisis we're in, and I referenced, I told our readers that we've been addressing these issues on banking crises and monetary crises since our inception. And I linked to your articles from February and March of 1990 in our monthly journal, Future of Freedom. You had two articles entitled Free Market Money Instead of Political Manipulation. And then the following month, March of 1990, On the Edge of Hyperinflation in Brazil. Yes. And one of our readers wrote back and said that he thoroughly enjoyed the second article. He had been to Brazil or lived in Brazil, something like that. And so who knows, Richard, you never know what impact you're going to have with an article some 30 years ago.
Well, it's interesting. I'm teaching an intermediate macroeconomics this semester. And one of the subjects we cover, obviously, is inflation. And I remembered that article of mine about at the edge of hyperinflation in Brazil. I actually downloaded a PDF and suggested to my students that you will read it and you will like it. It could be on the test. So yeah, but those episodes are important, and I should just mention to the viewers and listeners, if I may, that in the March issue of Future of Freedom, the monthly publication, is my article on the 100th anniversary of the hyperinflations in Germany and Austria, and that reached its climax in 1923, in which I try to explain what happened and draw some of the lessons from them.
Yeah, well, this is what we've been doing, so I invite you all to come and visit our website at fff.org, subscribe to our FFF Daily, which we think is the best libertarian editorial commentary page on the internet, and of course this YouTube channel. So Richard, talking about history here at FFF, let's go back some 20 years. We're now commemorating the invasion of Iraq by the U.S. government 20 years ago. Quite a different tone than what happened 20 years ago, Richard, when you and I were addressing this issue. Of course, it wasn't the first time that we had talked about foreign policy. If you go all the way back to I think it was our May 1990 issue of Future of Freedom, which at that time was called Freedom Daily, we were addressing foreign policy there as well. But especially after the 9/11 attacks, you and I were relentless, along with the other writers for Future Freedom Foundation, talking about how foreign interventionism had motivated the anger and rage that arose out of the Middle East that ultimately manifested itself, not just in the 9/11 attacks, but also the attacks that came before it, like the one at the CIA headquarters in 93, the attack on the World Trade Center in 93, the attack on the USS Cole, the attacks on the U.S. embassies in East Africa, and then the 9/11 attacks. And then, of course, when they used the 9/11 attacks as a way to justify the invasion of Afghanistan, we were 100% against that invasion. We argued that it was just wrong to kill so many people, which inevitably this was going to happen in an invasion for the sake of killing or capturing a relatively small group of people. And of course, that's what happened. I mean, they ended up killing, I don't know what the ultimate numbers came out in Afghanistan, but hundreds of thousands of people, 99% of whom had nothing to do with the 9/11 attacks. They destroyed the entire country, and then they got thrown out with a lot of loss of life of American soldiers in the process. And then came Iraq, which whose 20th anniversary people are commemorating now. And we ardently oppose that. We pointed out Iraq has nothing to do with the 9/11. This is a sheer war of aggression. You're going to kill a lot of people for no good reason at all. And of course, both of these wars were undeclared. And Richard, I'm sure you recall as well that when we took these positions, we were holding lonely ground. There were not many libertarians that were doing this at this point. I mean, there had been libertarians opposing the Persian Gulf intervention in 1991, but this time around it was totally different. I mean, it was a tsunami in favor of the U.S. government and in favor of these two invasions. And I mean, I'll never forget the emails that we got inundated with, hate mails that you hate America, you love the terrorists, you love Saddam Hussein, and you're not a real American. And we hung in there, but boy, the loss of support, we lost a lot of donations there. We really had to clamp down. We had to, I had to cut salaries, I had to cut author fees. Those were very, very difficult times, but we never wavered. I mean, we believed we were right. We stood against these invasions. So it's kind of interesting to see now how many people. In fact, in Friday's FFF Daily, we're going to devote it entirely to articles on Iraq, where mainstream commentators are expressing regret that they supported that war, a war of aggression that killed so many people and maimed so many people and tortured so many people, none of whom had anything to do with 9/11, none of whom had done anything against the United States. And so we hung in there, and I think we were ultimately vindicated with our position, but those were difficult days. And let me just say that with respect to Iraq, that war, that invasion, it really didn't start with the invasion. The war against the Iraqi people had been going on before that, with the brutal system of sanctions that followed the Persian Gulf intervention. And of course, you and I ardently opposed the Gulf intervention in 1991, but the sanctions were brutal. I mean, we kind of look at sanctions as sort of a benign foreign policy tool, but they really are a weapon of war because they are intended to kill people. And in this case, they were intended to kill innocent Iraqi citizens, target them with death. And sure enough, over that 11-year period of time in which those sanctions were being enforced, hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children were being killed because the Pentagon had bombed the water and treatment plants during the Gulf War, knowing that this would spread infectious illnesses among the Iraqi people, and it did. So all these children are dying. And then in 96, Madeleine Albright, who's the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, she is asked by 60 Minutes whether the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children are worth it. And she says, well, yeah, it's worth it. And she's referring to regime change, because by this time they were blaming President H.W. Bush for not going into Iraq during the Gulf War and ousting Saddam Hussein from power, putting in another pro-U.S. dictator. And so they were using sanctions as a way to try to get rid of Saddam. And that's what Albright meant, why it was worth it. And by it, she meant regime change. And that was 500,000 Iraqi children that she said was worth it, their deaths. And then the sanctions went on for another 7 years, killing people. So the war really stretches all the way back to 1991. And I think it's also worth mentioning that none of these wars, the Gulf War, the Afghanistan War, the Iraq War, had the congressional declaration of war that the Constitution requires, which meant that these wars were illegal under our form of government. What do you think, Richard?
Well, I think that we need to remember that I want to put it in a slightly wider context, but let's just recall the two primary rationales for the invasion of Iraq. One of which was factually incorrect, and the other represented a great hubris and arrogance on the part of the US government. The factual error was the claim by the George W. Bush administration that there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. The claim that these were a meaningful threat either to the United States or its allies in the surrounding area of the Middle East, and that Saddam Hussein was refusing to turn over these weapons of mass destruction or to defuse them in some way. He was insisting that he had no weapons of mass destruction, and it was the duty and the responsibility of the United States and its broader own interest in that of those countries with which it was aligned or in some arrangement in the greater Middle East to see that this threat was removed. Now, of course, when they invaded Iraq and proceeded to spread the American forces throughout all the areas in which this was supposedly hiding places, they found no weapons of mass destruction. When Saddam Hussein said he had no such nuclear or biological weapons, it was absolutely the truth. So part of the rationale for this invasion presented at the Security Council meeting of the UN, that this was being done in the interest of the world, was based on a factual lie. But the other element of this was that in the immediate euphoria of having invaded Afghanistan, based upon the insistence upon revengeful justice against the trade towers, there was this group of policy advocates and policy makers in Washington, D.C., in the George W. Bush administration, who have been generally labeled as, quote, neocons, neoconservatives, who believe strongly that if America was to be safe in the world, it was not sufficient for America to be secure in its own democracy and freedom at home. It was insufficient for it even to have a buffer of alliances such as NATO or strategic agreements with Japan and Australia. No, America could only be safe ultimately in a world that was completely democratic and in which all authoritarian and totalitarian regimes had been superseded or replaced, either through pressures or violence. The overthrow of Saddam was viewed as a linchpin move in bringing the dominoes to fall of authoritarian regimes in the Middle East. And with it, of course, the related danger of terrorism, where they might be lurking under the sanctuary of any other governments. And that therefore, the idea was that in overthrowing Saddam, American forces entering Baghdad, this would be the entree to a new and democratic Middle East. There was this image that American soldiers, like American soldiers who entered Paris in August of 1944 with their French allies, the crowds would be waving the little American flags. They would be singing national anthems of liberty and freedom. And American soldiers, after a brief period, could go home and democracy would prevail in a country that had only known tyranny and the brutality of a tyrant. And, you know, your eyes became misty and you heard that even though it was a foreign country, the American anthem playing in the background and the fields of waving grain across the prairies of America, that every country would be like us. Oh, you know, I'm getting a little choked up myself here, Jacob. Please bear with me for a minute. Well, a fact is that this was the arrogance of the social engineer, the hubris of the global central planner, who believed that people sitting in Washington, D.C., or think tanks in New York could remake a society from top to bottom, thousands of miles away, in which its history, its culture, its religious background was totally different than anything experienced either in the United States or the Western nations of Europe. That you could just remake a society like ours. That suddenly religious animosities between sects of Islam would fall apart. That prejudices about the place of women in society would diminish. That terrorism and the hiding of terrorists would just evaporate, because everybody, no matter how they look like on the outside, is a little American in the inside, begging to come out. Now, you know, by golly, I'm as proud as anybody else to be an American. Yahoo! And and I do believe in the values of the original founding of America, that there is and should be a belief and a practice of individual liberty, rule of law, private property, freedom of association, limited constitutional government, sound money, and the others that represent the ideals of economic and social and political liberalism. That was the linchpin of ideas behind the American founding. But and I would hope that these ideas could spread everywhere, and that we could eventually have an ecumenical globe and a world community that was founded on the principles of liberty rightly understood. But as much as I would hope that, and that could be hopefully a future at some point for the world, the fact is the world is divided into segments and parts in which history is developed in different ways, different cultures, different political traditions, different religions that are more or closed, more open or more closed in terms of tolerance and respect, a greater respect or recognition of property and freedom of association and exchange or not. And the fact is that these parts of the world, whether it be Afghanistan, Iraq, or Syria, and so on, may have individuals who aspire to these things. But alas, their society as a whole are grounded on different customs, traditions, and histories that make it difficult for this to be in a cookie-cut fashion from someone on the outside to remake them in our image. The result was that in attempting to do this, and even those who admitted that they were supporters of this and are now critics of it said, well, the US had no plan for the next day. The flags get waved and the soldiers have walked through, the center of Baghdad in victory, and then the world and the countryside will be just transformed. They gave no thought of what happens the next day when the existing institutional order, no matter how tyrannical and corrupt and brutal, is done away with, and there's a huge vacuum it creates, that there'll be other political forces that attempt to fill it internally, domestically, that have no roots in Western style liberty and individualism. And they'll just start fighting each other and view the Americans, thank you for overthrowing Saddam. We hated him. Yes, we did. But we don't want you telling us how to live. And we don't care if we have values different than yours and you want us to be like you. We don't want to be like you. We believe in religious intolerance. We believe in authoritarian tribalism. We believe in government control and corruption in the management of the economic affairs of society. We consider that stability and normality go away. And when we didn't go away, we just got sucked into years of combat and violence and atrocities and corruptions, such as that happened in those prison camps in Iraq, which became embarrassments for the US, of people captured and held as prisoners, terrorized, humiliated, tortured, photographs taken of them, some so shocking that they wouldn't even be shown on the news, even though in a sense they've been got from the government or from other sources. The fact is that this became a disaster. Now, what lessons should be learned from this, in my humble opinion? In my opinion, we should draw the conclusion that as much as we should attempt to be the idea and the ideal and the representative of these ideas of liberty, we cannot believe that we can impose them on other societies, but particularly by force. People will resent it, they'll oppose it, they will resist it, they will be violent against it. But instead, what do we have in the world today? The same social engineers, the same global central planners. We see this in places like Ukraine, we see this in places in Asia or Africa, where the United States continues to intervene, intrude, attempt to influence the domestic politics and the global outcomes, because these people think that they know better how the world should be organized than people in those parts of the world want their own societies to be organized. And no matter how different from ours and how philosophically we may disagree with the underlying premises, we cannot make over people unless the people themselves want to be remade. And that comes from the inside. We cannot create it for them from the outside.
All right, you raise a lot of good points. Let me respond to a few of them. On your WMD point, you're absolutely right. This was a magnificent lie that was, and I use magnificent in the pejorative sense of the word, sarcastic sense of the word, because they always were claiming that it was just an innocent mistake, that they really thought there were going to be WMDs there. And it's clear that it was a lie. And one of the best evidence of that is that as soon as it became apparent that there were no WMDs, all they had to do was apologize. I mean, that's what you would have done if you'd made a mistake. It's like, God, we're sorry, we made a mistake. We've killed all these people. We've invaded your country. It's a bad mistake. We're going home and we'll send you reparations. We're very sorry. That's not what happened. They just stayed. And they converted it into Operation Iraqi Freedom. They said, oh, well, this is really about bringing freedom to the Iraqi people. Well, the people they killed weren't experiencing this freedom. The people they maimed and had their houses destroyed and so forth. I mentioned that this Friday we're including all 10 articles of FFF Daily are going to be on Iraq, and we're including in some of those some firsthand accounts of Iraqis saying, look what you did to my country. And one woman's account is very moving. She said, we were there when the bombs started falling, and we were begging my father to leave our store and our home and everything because the bombs were hitting ever closer. And another guy says, you brought terrorism to our country. And Richard, my recollection is that before the whole Persian Gulf War and the whole sanctions and everything, that the people in Baghdad and generally in Iraq had fairly high standards of living. Now, sure, they were living under a brutal dictator, but nonetheless, a lot of people live under brutal dictatorships around the world. That the Iraqis had a fairly or relatively higher standard of living. That was decimated by this over 10 years of warfare by the U.S. Here's another interesting twist on the WMDs. A few years after the invasion, U.S. forces discovered some canisters, rusted out canisters of WMDs that had been buried. And there were those saying, see, they're the WMDs. But U.S. officials said, no, we don't want to talk about those. Those are not the WMDs. And the reason is because those WMDs had made in the USA on them, or made in the West. And if you look at FFF's website, you do a search for where did Iraq get its weapons of mass destruction, I have a compilation of articles. Some of the links are dead now, but back then they were all active links, that Saddam had gotten his weapons of mass destruction from the US and from the West when he was waging war against Iran in the 80s. And just to show you the moral perversity of the kind of people you're talking about with their hubris and engineering and so forth, they were partnering with this guy in the 1980s. They were furnishing him the WMDs to help him kill Iranians, because Iranians had the audacity to oust the Shah of Iran, who the CIA had installed into power in a CIA coup back in 1953. And the CIA hadn't forgiven the Iranian people for doing that, and so they needed to be killed, and that's why they were partnering with Saddam. So I think that's an important thing. Another thing is that these were UN resolutions. Even if Saddam did have weapons of mass destruction, only the UN could enforce its own resolutions, not the US. But the US took this obnoxious, pretentious attitude of, well, we're the big figure in the UN, so we can enforce its resolutions, even though the UN said we will not enforce its resolution with force. They were convinced that Saddam was telling the truth, that all these things had been destroyed. And the lessons you draw are extremely important, Richard, because I look at this thing now and I say, what changed in a fundamental sense? You've still got the whole national security establishment in place, rather than a limited government republic, which was our founding system. The Pentagon, the CIA, the NSA, they're clearly still in charge of foreign policy. They've ginned up this crisis with Ukraine. They're getting us ever closer to nuclear war, like they did back in '62 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. They're ginning up this crisis with China, another nuclear power. It's that same mindset of hubris that we can engineer things, we can control things around the world, and in the process bring massive death and destruction, not to mention the destruction of our own liberty here at home. And that's one of the biggest messages for me that the founding fathers gave us. Oppose standing armies. Standing armies are your greatest threat to your liberty and your well-being, not some foreign regime, not Russia, China, Syria, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, and so forth, Cuba. No, the biggest threat to your freedom and well-being is your very own big standing military establishment. And that's why there was no national security state for more than 100 years in this country. We had a basic military force, a limited government republic, and rejected this whole idea of the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA, and the FBI as well. And I think that until Americans start doing some real soul searching and start talking about getting this America back on the right track in favor of its sound founding principle of a limited government republic, we're going to be continuing heading this country in a very bad and a very dangerous, i.e., nuclear war direction.
Yeah, you see, the greatest difficulty in this is that it's sort of like domestic policies. You're saying you admit you're wrong, and you admit your mistakes, and try to reverse them. But those in political power, whether it be the politicians holding office who want to run again, or whether it be the permanent bureaucrats who oversee these institutions, they have it in their own self-interest never to say that they're sorry, never to admit that they made a mistake, because that is an opening for your opponent, a justification for you to be investigated and removed from a bureaucratic position of responsibility and authority, and the perks and salaries and career pensions that might come from it. So they have a self-interested motive, whether it be a domestic agency or a foreign policy agency, never to admit that they made mistakes, should have done something different, or it caused grievous harm both to foreigners and Americans in the process. And so their notion of lessons, their notion of lesson is that, well, we have to learn how to do these interventions abroad with better results. So next time we go in and intervene directly in some country around the world, well, we just have to be prepared better to build up a nation building government, a substitute government when we've overthrown the existing one. Or we have to know how to bribe and corruptly influence political elections in another country better than we have in the past. Or we have to be assured that we can bully other nations in such a way that we can get what they want, but they can't either politically or militarily retaliate against us better. In other words, how do you try to browbeat the end to someone like Fidel Castro, but not create a situation where another superpower tries to put nuclear missiles in our backyard? How do we get our results, but without those negative impact dangers? Just look at the situation in the Ukraine. What is the general policy perspective that you hear from those in decision-making roles and in the wider policymaking think tank framework? What you hear them say is that, well, the world's future is at stake on America following a certain course. America supporting financially, America supporting militarily, America seeing that allies act and support us with material, just as we're giving, so we're not the only givers. Another version of what George Bush called, if you recall, what was it, the alliance of the willing, or whatever he called it, the
coalition of the willing.
Yes. So it's the same mentality. They're just saying is, how can we do it better? It's sort of like the current financial crisis. Are they admitting that they bungled it after the financial and housing crisis of 08, 09 with quantitative easing and artificially making interest rates down to zero and creating all the money that created the price inflation and now the financial instability? No. Oh, this is a crisis, not really of our making, but now we've learned how to intervene better. We're going to backstop everybody's account, 100% in every bank. And that makes sure that we won't have any of the financial crises problems. It's further intervention, more control, refined ways of doing things. Now, that mentality domestically is the same mentality in foreign affairs, because too much is at stake in the belief system and the self-interest of those who are gaining from this.
That is an absolute fantastic point. You are absolutely right. That's the only lesson they ever learned from these interventions, that we made mistakes and that next time we'll do it better. They never questioned the very paradigm of foreign interventionism itself. And that's not surprising. I mean, it's in their interest. You've got these war contractors that have been feeding it the public trough for decades. Why would they want to give that up? And which means that the real solution to this lies with the American people. When they finally achieve a breakthrough in saying, you know what, we want to restore the good founding principles of this country. And I mentioned one of those was a limited government republic, but another one is our founding system of non-interventionism. Now, today they talk in terms of, oh, well, let's have selective foreign interventionism only when it's in our vital interests, our national interests. Well, you could drive a Mack truck through that exception, because guess who makes that determination? Those that are intervening. And they're always going to say it's in our national interest or vital interest. If we go back to John Quincy Adams' 4th of July address in 1821, In Search of Monsters to Destroy, we learned that our founding foreign policy system was one of non-interventionism. In other words, limit the government to defending the United States from a foreign invasion, which is a non-existent possibility today. We ought to be taking advantage of this. Bring all the troops home from everywhere. Close all those hundreds of military bases all over the world, including the ones encircling China and encircling Russia. Bring them all home, dismantle them, discharge the soldiers into the private sector, and then start doing the same domestically. What do we have all these bases here domestically for? What are they good for? Get rid of them. And then now we're talking about putting this country back on the right road. But that's what it's going to take, Richard. It's going to take a revival among the American people, because you can't put your faith in people in Washington to shift paradigms.
Absolutely.
All right. On that note, Richard, we're out of time. Thank you all for tuning in. Again, come and visit us at fff.org. Subscribe to our FFF Daily, also our monthly journal, Future of Freedom. Richard, as always, enjoyed the conversation. I look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.